Okay, so welcome to EWOC's political education event on pre-majority unionism. EWOC is the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee. We're a project of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, and the United Electrical Workers Union. And what we do at EWOC is we help non-union workers who are fighting for justice in the workplace organize for justice in the workplace. That is what we do. And so if you are a worker looking for guidance and how to go about that, please see the link in the chat. We'll post this a few times. Megan, do you mind dropping the link in the chat to our Talk to an Organizer form so that folks can talk to an organizer about what's going on at work? So just a brief overview of why we're doing this event and what it's about. So at the beginning of COVID, we saw a rise in worker militancy in non-union workplaces explode. And it was a level of collective workplace action that the labor movement as it stood then was not designed to support. We have been able to make a dent in this with our hundreds of volunteers and workers who we have been working together to change this little by little. But given that union density rates have been hovering around 10% nationwide and as low as 6% in the private sector for decades, our experiences have shown us that militant, rank and file led workplace organizing that is led by, in many cases, non-union workers must be supported and strengthened at all costs if the labor movement will have a chance to grow at a meaningful scale and get out of this 10% slump. So as much as we would love this to always result in officially recognized unions, the reality of the US context dictates that much of this organizing will take place outside of the context of traditional collective bargaining agreements. So the pre-majority model, or what some people call the minority unionism model or the non-contractual unionism model, it is necessary at this historic moment. And of course, like all models, it has pros and cons, it takes many different forms, and it includes a range of strategic considerations. So that's what we'll be discussing tonight. So before I just introduce the format, I'll tell folks that we have an incredible panel of workers and organizers who are based in or have organized or worked in Massachusetts, Georgia, North Carolina, in the industries range from nonprofits to engine manufacturing to software engineering to higher education to plastics manufacturing. They organize in public and private sectors, and they formed pre-majority unions for different strategic reasons, some based on the business structure of their employer, others based due to statewide legislation. And some of these are pre-majority shops that went public a year ago, and some went public over 30 years ago. So we have an incredible range for you. Briefly, the format will do 3-minute intros. We'll ask everyone to say their name, their affiliation with the labor movement, and what does pre-majority unionism mean to you? So again, we have 3 minutes for that, and then we'll go into questions of the panelists, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. So I'll introduce myself, I guess, briefly, and then pass it off. So my name is Colette. I've worn many different hats in the labor movement for about 15 years. I currently work on the Organize with the Media team in EWOC, and I am an academic worker and very active member of my own union, UCW Colorado, which is CWA Local 7799. So I will pass it to Ani, then to Jim, then to Rebecca, then to Dave. So Ani, take it away.
Hi everyone, excited to be here. My name is Ani. I'm a member of the Alphabet Workers Union of the Communications Workers of America. I'm an elected member of the AWU Executive Council and currently the organizing chair. As far as my story, so I work as a software engineer on Google Cloud near Boston. When I found out about what my company does as far as warfare and defense contracts, it was pretty disgusting to me, and I was driven to start organizing. So after I took an organizer training, I started talking to my coworkers. We started an organizing committee and formed a union at Google and Alphabet. So I think we started that campaign around 1.5 years ago and have successfully launched our union publicly at the start of this year. We grew from about 100, 200 people to nearly 900 now, spanning all sorts of job types, not just software engineers, but data center workers. Actually, I'm not going to give a bunch of job types and give the boss any information, but lots of different kinds of job types, especially encompassing across a 2-tier workforce of both full-time workers and subcontractor workers, which make up over half of the worldwide population of workers at Alphabet. As far as pre-majority unionism, I mean, we just take it back to the basics. A union is two or more people taking action in the workplace to protect one another and make our lives better. And we don't need the government or our bosses to tell us when we have a union. We have a union because we say that we do and we formed one. And so, we're excited to organize. We're excited to be here talking about our model, what we've done, and really more importantly, what we plan to do in the future to, grow the movement at Google, at Alphabet, among tech workers, but really among the entire working class.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ani. Let's pass it over to Jim.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. My name is Jim Wren. I'm in Tarboro, North Carolina, and I've been recently retired from the Cummins Rocky Mount engine plant after 35 years on the block line. And there I was with the Carolina Auto Aerospace Machine Workers Union chapter of the statewide UE Local 150. And we've been began as the CEC Workers Union Committee back in 1990 when workers came together to organize a petition campaign to get the Martin Luther King holiday as a paid holiday. And we had a very active campaign for 8 months before we could convince the company to give us a new paid holiday for Martin Luther King Day, which we used to build the movement. And out of that, we started taking up other issues. One of the things that we, at the time in the 1980s and the early 90s here in Eastern North Carolina, in the Rocky Mount, Wilson, Greenville area, we saw a number of plants where the workers tried to go through the Nlrb election and would lose by a few votes. We had one case here in Rocky Mount where the workers had gone through 3 elections in 10 years and kept losing, even though they had quite a large level of support. They could never win the election, and so they wanted to establish their union, their shop stewards. At that time, the United Auto Workers turned their back on them and walked away. Didn't want to accept them on that level, but the United Electrical Workers was the only one at that time that was willing to accept us, the CEC workers, on that level, which we affiliated with UE in 1994. And then we carried out a lot of campaigns. In North Carolina, we then reached out to public workers, and we were part of a process that established statewide UE Local 150 by 1999 with public workers, which in North Carolina do not have the right to collective bargaining. So they're in the same situation we are without a contract. So in 2003, we got our charter from the UE as a dues-paying chapter of UE with full membership rights of the union, and we're part of the labor movement. We usually go through, we have what we call the petition tradition. We try to take up issues first by petitioning. We utilize the labor board, the EOC. We had several campaigns where we petition campaigns and agitation campaigns where we got 2 workers reinstated who were fired back in 96 and also in 99. We made a lot of differences through our efforts. In 2004 to 2006, we filed a lawsuit, federal wage and hour, North Carolina wage and hour lawsuit against Cummins for failure to give us all of our bonus we earned in 2002. That was a big victory. And we had over 200 workers on a lawsuit, and it was a members only lawsuit. And we won a decision from the judge. We also our Unity News, I can show this right here. Our newsletter, which we started in 1992 and still put out to this day, is our main vehicle in the plant. We had to fight for a number of years to get the right to uphold the right to pass this out in non-work areas and non-work times in the plant. We had a labor board case that went all the way to the 4th Circuit Court of Richmond, Virginia, which won a unanimous decision. And this is, I can't tell you how powerful this is to have the unfettered right to distribute our union news throughout the plant. And this gets the word out and gets our the support base activated. As you can see, we just recently had two successful, I think you can see that, labor board settlements on two cases we had. In one case, we had a group of workers from the block line department last year that, because of rising floodwaters in the area, got together at lunchtime and decided they were going to go home. And even though the plant would not close down, they informed their manager, we're going home as a group. And 16 of them left work. They were then disciplined, and we filed labor board charges. And the labor board found merit in the case, and the discipline was removed. And they had to remove and had to post a notice, on the bulletin board. And this is just, we've had probably a dozen cases like this over the years.
Jim, this is on that incredible note, on that incredible victory note, let's move on to finish the intros, and then we'll come back and ask some more questions about the wins and the experiences. How does that sound? Awesome. Okay.
Sorry.
No, you're good. Let's move on to Becca for a quick intro.
Yeah, I wish that we had had some of those walk off the jobs over some of the COVID safety stuff in my union. And we actually did some similar struggles trying to support our members. So I want to hear more. My name is Becca, and my pronouns are she or they, and I teach biology at Georgia Gwinnett College. It's a 4-year public college in Georgia, and it's the most diverse in the Southeast with a solidly working class student body. And the way that we got our chapter started was when our employer told us that we had to teach an additional class for no additional pay. And so this is a real classic speed up. You don't think of higher ed as something where you can just make it go faster. Well, apparently they thought it was. And so we reached out and started organizing with UCW. And with respect to what I think pre-majority unionization, union movement kind of contributes, I've been on leadership bodies within UCW since 2018. And I'm currently the secretary of United Campus Workers of Georgia. So I have a historical view of what it has felt like day to day to be in a pre-majority union. And it is an activist endeavor. What it means to me is that we don't always get to pick the terrain, but we get to choose if we want to fight back, right? We don't get to pick our context, but then we get to decide, okay, I'm going to take the fight to my employer anyway. I think that there are lots of reasons why the best way to protect workers and make your employer do right, lots of reasons why that might not be trying to go through a formal election process. For us, that's state legislation, but there are many, many other examples where you build actual power with your coworkers and then assert your rights and make a difference in your sector even, and maybe even in the larger union movement through conversations like this. So looking forward to it.
Beautiful. Thank you, Becca. And last but certainly not least, Dave.
Hi, this is exciting. I'm Dave Cohen. My pronouns are he or him. I'm a retired international representative for the United Electrical Workers Union. I worked in a factory in Holyoke, Massachusetts in the early 70s, and we organized into the UE. I became president of the UE local, and eventually the factory I worked in moved to Taiwan, Mexico, and Brazil, and I ended up working for the UE for another 40 years or so. So here's what I think about pre-majority unions. So I look at it, it's a path or a tactic to building militant, democratic, majority-supported, what I would call rank and file unions. And especially given the current nature of the National Labor Relations Act, and then how that affects all the other state laws. And specifically the Nlrb, now that it has the free speech for employers clause was put into it in the 1940s, that made organizing unions very difficult. So to me, in essence, it means building unions in workplaces, getting workers to fight for their rights, for their benefits, for improvements on the job, rather than just building an organization that's going to try and win an election through the National Labor Relations Board. I firmly believe that it's a path to getting building a majority supported union and forcing the employer to recognize the union and hopefully bargaining a contract. But that remains to be seen how that works out in the end. So that's basically what I think pre-majority unions are. And I'll talk about UE's experiences later on.
Beautiful. Well, thank you all so much for being here. And I should say to our audience as well, please put your questions, use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. You'll see a series of icons on the bottom. Stick your questions in there, and then they'll make their way over to me by the end toward the end when we start to get at questions. So we have some crowdsourced questions from various members of EWOC for each of the panelists. So we'll go in the same order. And I'll start with Ani. So Ani, what can you tell us about Alphabet Worker Union's recent formation? How was your adoption of this particular model influenced by other examples of pre-majority unionism? Was it at all? And if so, how? And then what can you tell us specifically, because I believe that AWU is wall-to-wall. Is that right? So what can you tell us about organizing across blue and white collar sectors within the company as well?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't have many hours to answer all these questions, so I'm going to try my best to condense all of it. But I think when you look at Google and Alphabet, there's been a long history of workers kind of speaking up and having ownership over the work, but also like what our work is used for. I think what we've found over the last 10, 15 years is that the company is changing. Like, it doesn't work the same way as it did before. You see the company being a lot more interested in particular business interests, which are anti-worker, pro-war, and so on. And so there've been a lot of advocacy over the years, around ethical issues, around sexual harassment in the workplace, of course, with the women's walkout a couple of years ago. I would say that over these years, these were kind of primarily based among, full-time engineers who could stick their neck out, put your name on a petition, because, we still come at this with a lot of privilege at our current state, but we also know it's not going to last. When it comes to our formation, I mean, it's a long, really interesting, fun story. It's been, I think, about almost 2 years now, 2+ years of me doing this now. Absolutely, we were influenced by other forms of unions that had done this before. Like, I got my starting from a training based off of IWW's training, and we learned about solidarity unions, all this sort of thing, and how it worked. And I think you can look at a company like Alphabet, and it seems ununionizable, right? Like, it's about 250,000 workers around the world. The composition of the workforce is really strange, but you also see that workers in some cases are treated really well and might not have as much reason or material interest at this moment to unionize. So a lot of challenges we had to overcome to get to this point. But I think that really what it comes down to for us is kind of like building a culture of care and solidarity in our workplace. We're showing that our union is a place where workers take care of one another. And these are the things that are like really important to Google workers on the whole. They just don't realize that it doesn't align with what our boss's mission is, right? It doesn't align with the profit motives and the profit incentives. And so, when it comes to like our model of unionism, I mean, we came to CWA with this, we came to the Communications Workers of America, CWA, and we asked, can we just form a union with who we have? Is this possible? Is this legal? How does this even work? After doing a lot of research about the Nlrb process and contract certification, and we were surprised to see not only was CWA supportive, but that they had real life examples that have been doing this for 20, 30 years. So it's a real honor to be on panels with folks from UCW, because I think your union, the Texas State Employees Union, seeing these kind of shining beacons of unions that have struggled for over 30 years when the law and the government and the workplace didn't support organized, but have survived anyway. Like, I think it was a major motivation for us when we saw that, like, okay, this is a real thing that we can actually do. As for our recent formation, so we launched publicly at the start of this year as the Alphabet Workers Union. As I mentioned earlier, we've grown to a lot more people than we started with about a year ago, right? And I think that, like, as far as organizing across blue and white collar workers, like, these issues come up a lot. I think the question is kind of like, who is it important to, right? Like, right now we're such a tiny, minuscule percentage of the company. It's easy to get all the socialists and the radicals like into a union. I mean, you would think it's not actually that easy, because talking and doing is two different things for organizing. But right now, like, it's really easy to say, yes, we are here for solidarity with our subcontract workers. We really want to support all these people. But I think that the politics are going to be interesting as it develops, right? Because we don't want to be like a radical book club of 10 people. Like that doesn't build any power. That doesn't have any impact on the world. Arguing on Twitter doesn't have any impact on the world. And so like what we're about is we're introducing unions to a workforce that has never had a union before, right? We're showing what unions are about and why this is in all of our interests, and why whether you're a worker in a data center, a worker who's a software engineer in an office, like our interests are combined, our fates are combined, because as shitty as Google is going to treat, I mean, I'll just mention this one person we met, Shannon Waite, who was a worker in the data center. She was experiencing retaliation from her subcontractor. After asking for a water bottle, she reported unsafe working conditions. And this is like, again, $1 trillion company that's online in the middle of a global pandemic. Like these companies will treat you as shittily as they can get away with. And the only counterbalancing force is workers organizing. So I hope that answered all the questions. Again, this is something I can talk about for many, many hours, and I'll be happy to answer any other questions later as well.
Awesome, and you're still totally in time. So anyway, this saves more time for us to come back and ask more. Wonderful. So let's move on to Jim. I mean, it's interesting, just a side note, we have workers from UE and CWA here, and it's true, these are the two unions who have sort of fostered pre-majority union models for 30 plus years in a way that most other unions in this country have not, which I think says a lot about those unions and what they're willing to do to build worker power. Also says a lot about the workers who build that power and come to them. So let's move to Jim. Jim, you worked at Cummins Rocky Mount Engine Plant for over 35 years. And obviously, as we now know, you were very active in your own pre-majority union with UE Local 150. Can you tell us about what you have learned from your experiences with your local, and specifically how a member-driven democratic approach played a part in your organizing efforts and allowed you to have the wins that you've had?
Well, our effort is worker based, from the very beginning, and our practice is that we don't rely necessarily. I mean, UE has never subsidized us. Everything we do, from our newsletters to other stuff, we generate our own funds to do that through our dues paying members, and we as I say, our practice is when issues come up, we advocate people take a petition from the workers in that department or for plant wide, and these petition efforts are a way to engage workers across the plant in issues. So it's concerted activity, and it's our starting point, to address issues. When we have a union is not being defined as a Nlrb election or contract. We have a union as a group of workers who are going to come together to fight for one another and fight for their rights, and that's what we have shown. And even though the company does not technically recognize us, they have to deal with us because of the way we address issues, and they know that we're going to do petitions. We're going to send stuff to the corporate office. We're going to, if we see a labor law being violated, we're going to file labor board charges, and they're going to address us there. We file wage and hour complaints or whatever. So many times the company has tried to say that we would not win this, win that, and then we did win. So it's, and I would like to say that also that understand in terms of our plant, in terms of North Carolina, East North Carolina, as the Black Belt, North Carolina, we have our workforce is majority African American, live in a half American majority community, and we've reached out to our community allies through a community empowerment alliance that UE helped us build many years ago. So we're engaged with the community, and we have community support. We support community on their issues, and the community supports us in terms of different issues that we put pressure on the company to resolve. I don't know if that answers your question. We have a democratic process, and we've had, our process, our election process has been pretty democratic, and we have stewards throughout the plant. We have dues paying members throughout the plant, and they're part of a statewide, local, and national union. And so many we've had representatives go from our local to national UE conventions and whatnot. So clearly, the thing is that we have workers who are part of the national labor movement. And if you take this approach, it's this Nlrb election all or nothing, then you're leaving out so many workers who can be part of this labor movement, organized to fight for their rights and fight for Medicare for all and other things that we have on our agenda.
Beautiful, Jim. Thank you so much for that. So let's move on to Becca. So Becca, what can you tell us about your experience with UCW and organizing a pre-majority union within higher ed specifically, especially in the context of Georgia labor law and the labor movement more broadly?
Yeah, that's also a huge question. And so I'm glad we're in a larger conversation here and get a chance for follow-up questions. I'll just try to set the stage for what we're up to here by reminding people that there has been an increase in revenues into higher ed that were specific to student fees and tuition, an increase of 29% between 2009 and 2019. What is that about? It's because the state and the federal government stopped funding higher education somewhere around the mid 2000s. And then especially after 2008, we took a huge hit. And so that has been kind of played out by having increasing privatization, increasing the precarity, the instability of the workforce that does instruction and does the staffing, and also the mountain of student debt that our country is plagued with, right? So those are the consequences of that. When we get underfunded, that is what comes downstream. And so that's some of our moment right now in higher ed. And I think it's related to why UCW has grown as a model so massively recently. And alongside that, there was, in that same kind of era, a slashing of labor protections throughout the country, right? But bunches of different states became, quote, right to work states, i.e. restricting the ability to organize. And then we had the Janus versus AFSCME Supreme Court decision that put that on a federal level. And so there is this institutionalization of anti-labor laws spreading throughout the country. So that into that, we see this huge growth of UCWs throughout the country. It is a model that is really working and spreading. When I first started hearing about this in 2016, there was only one established UCW, one in Tennessee. And now we have, I think it's 10 different states with UCWs, either in formation or, so that's 2016 to now. This is really happening in a particular political moment and in response to something real. And our model is wall to wall. So everyone who gets their paycheck from the University System of Georgia can be a part of our union. And it is also one that has this activist orientation that we've been hearing from a bunch of different places. We hear again and again that you need to have collective bargaining rights in order to win anything. And you hear that the South is too conservative to have a healthy, active union. And I think both of these are completely false. We build and win on individual, on legislative, on activist, and also nationwide, huge economic gains. And I'm just going to list off a few for you and can elaborate if folks are interested later on in the Q&A. For individuals, we do things like call-in campaigns. We mobilize and have a protest outside an administrator's office. Every once in a while, we protest outside some donors or donor events. We sometimes hand out flyers to prospective students. So we do individual things to try to push back against a particular employer. For example, there was a grad student who was about to be fired because he had politically controversial tweets, anti-racist tweets, and we organized and he kept his job. We had a staff member who reported some safety issues in her workplace. They cut her hours. We organized they replaced her hours. We had a faculty member who was part of the faculty senate and gave the administration grief. He was denied promotion. We organized and we won back the appeal. So these are ways in which there's a very concrete day-to-day, just coworker kind of support. We also, we just won protections. We do a lot of legislative work, and we just won protections for our unhoused students to not have to show proof of residence in order to get in-state tuition. Like, we just won that in this last legislative session. So that's an example of the kind of thing that we try to fight for during the legislative sessions. We've introduced cost of living adjustments, which we don't get. So like, I get a pay cut every year I work here, right? Because that's called inflation. We don't get cost of living adjustments. We're fighting for that at the state legislature level. We're fighting to drop all the grad student fees. We want to process for sexual harassment in the workplace, most especially against graduate students. So those are the legislative fights. During the pandemic, we put out a petition that got 12,000 signatures, which was a little, wow, okay. 12,000 signatures requiring or pushing on the Board of Regents in Georgia to mandate masks. And we won. The Board of Regents in Georgia is made up of the nastiest of the business elite in this state. And we won. We won that. It was amazing. We've also pushed back against the privatization of some of the dorms. The Board of Regents sold off their debt to a company called Corvius that has been pretty famous for substandard housing for military barracks, and also now defrauding students of their housing money. And nationwide, Knoxville, Tennessee just won a $1,000 increase for the lowest paid adjunct professors. Memphis, Tennessee won a $15 an hour minimum wage for their entire campus. And Kentucky won, I had to write it down because the list is so long. Kentucky won paid family leave, retirement contributions, salary increases, and a $1,000 bonus just last month. So this really does work. This model really does work. And I'll just end on this. What do these wins teach us, or what are the lessons that I've learned thus far in this kind of ongoing journey? Public sector unions. So we have to form coalitions with those directly impacted by the way that our employer runs our institutions. So we're talking to students and we're talking to community members. And this is akin to some of the alphabet stuff, talking to the people who are hurt by your employer's misdeeds. And we also have to have deep democracy in our union. If our union's protections are not in some piece of paper or some legal proceedings, if they're in us, then we have to own our own union and be really engaged. So we have monthly statewide calls where we determine our priorities for the next month collectively by a vote. Every member is invited every single month, like serious transparency and democracy. And we have to develop members. We have to actually drill down on some of the trainings. I teach biology, y'all. I didn't know how to look into the Board of Regents tax returns. Someone had to teach me. And I want to know, because I know they're out to get me and I want to figure out how. So teaching members with a very diverse sets of skills how to be a really active participant in building a labor movement, that I think is a hugely important thing. Big questions, breaking down barriers between different job categorizations, especially because academia is so hierarchical. Another big question, how much emphasis should we put on trying to win collective bargaining rights? Because this model is really good for activity and learning and participation. So I'd love to hear other panelists' thoughts on that. Thank you.
Those are great questions, and we'll come back to those in just a few minutes. So yeah, fantastic. And Becca, I'll say, I am getting messages from my coworkers at UCWC talking about how your recent budget report has been such an influence, all these things. So this is just happening in real time. Let's move on now to Dave before we put some more questions to the whole panel. So Dave, tell us about your experiences organizing with UE and how it relates to everything we're hearing tonight. Tell us specifically about them and us principles, right? That's the sort of the UE frame, is the them and us principles. Tell us about that, what that means. And how does that fit in with what we've heard tonight from your fellow panelists about pre-majority unionism?
Sure. So I'll just say, quickly, when I started with the UE back in the early 70s, I hate to say it was that long ago, the UE went through Nlrb elections at that time, but the motto that was drilled into me was that first you build a union and you have a functioning fighting union, and then when you can, you go to the Nlrb and win an election and then make the company bargain with you. But that emphasis from the 1930s, still existed. You build the union first. That's what you're talking about doing. And so that was really how all of us were really trained that. So for the UE, the 70s was an active period of organizing lots of unions. But, over time, employers began to use their employer free speech and their terror tactics in very sophisticated manners, very highly sophisticated. And by, say, the 1990s, it was very clear to us that we weren't able to win Nlrb elections. You just could not do it. The terror that employers would unleash and that the labor board allowed them to unleash made that path very hard to go down. So we started looking for other things. In the 1990s, we decided to try and organize plastic workers. And that was basically because we used to have a lot of metal workers in the UE, and metal was disappearing, right? And things were being replaced by plastic. So we decided to look at, plastic workers nationwide. So we started building plastic worker organizing committees wherever we could, inside factories, and training people on how to fight on issues, how to raise hell. We did a lot of educational work on what were people's rights under the Nlrb using Section 7, which gives you the right to organize and to take concerted activity. And so we really trained people on how to do that. We ran campaigns at one point for $1 an hour raise for the plastic industry. And by the time we were doing that, there was some 50 to 75 factories that we could identify where bosses came out and gave workers $1 an hour raises. Because some did it because they were just afraid, hoped that would keep the union out. Others, because of what the workers did, they got the money. And, sort of one of the other things that came out of that whole period is we started holding what we call community elections. And, oftentimes workers would want to go to the Nlrb, right? They heard that's how you got the union. So what we did when we thought we had a majority, we would have someone from the community, a local priest, a local police chief or someone come out and sit outside the factory, and workers would come out and vote whether they wanted the union or not. And we ran it very, under the best conditions we could. And what would happen usually is we would win overwhelmingly. And we even encouraged the anti-union workers to come out and vote. We wanted to involve them in the process. And what that did was it gave the workers a sense, hey, we have a union, right? We already knew we had a union. Now we've won an election. The employer ought to recognize us. And it helped us when we did go to Nlrb elections, because at that point, it became the employee was trying to take your union away. You already voted for it. The majority voted for it, and they're trying to take it away. I would say, listening to some of the other remarks, that one of the things I always thought was best about using this tactic of building non-majority unions, and someone else said it, 2 or more workers getting together to fight to better their working conditions is a union. We had a case at a big factory up in New Hampshire, very high paid, where the workers were organizing. We were doing this. And the boss would always come out and tell them, you have to go to the Nlrb. You don't have a union until you have an election. And the workers would say, no, we have a union. Here's our union cards. We're members of UE. And they'd go in and raise hell and fight with the boss. And the boss would always come out and say, no, you can't do that. You haven't gone to the Nlrb yet. And they said, well, we're not gonna. We have a union. And then through that corporation's entire strategy, which was geared towards an Nlrb election and threatening the workers out of voting for a union. And the corporation didn't know how to handle it at all. So when I listen, also the other point I think is very important, this path leads to workers having democratic unions that they run, right? You can't have workers who are going to be fighting over years and, like people are doing here and winning and fighting and organizing. And then some union bureaucrat's going to come along and tell them, no, you can't do that. You can't do this, you can't do that. Because the workers have experience in running their own union. And to me, that's a key point that comes out of this whole thing. So just, finally on when you say them and us unionism. So them and us was the title of Jim Matlis, who was the first director of organization of the union, his book he wrote. I do have to say, Jim told me after he wrote that book, which is a great book, that after he retired, he would write the real history of the union and name names and things like that. But it's still a great book. Them and Us Unionism basically just recognizes that class struggle is a reality. There's a corporate class, a ruling class, and there's workers. And we don't have anything in common. And workers have to fight against the bosses in order to improve their standard of living. And that's the basic essence of them and us class struggle unionism. Even when you have a contract, you fight. You're always fighting to push it, to stretch it, to get more. You don't wait just for negotiations. You're always pushing and agitating. So I think in some ways it was summed up during that period when a lot of unions were promoting labor management cooperation, and we should sit down and work together. Red Block, who's the general secretary treasurer of the union, said, when the lion and the lamb lay down together, it's usually the lion that gets up and burps. And I think that was a good summation of what that non-class struggle unionism was about. So that's it.
Beautiful. Man, thank you all so much for that. So we have some questions. I mean, just sort of to summarize, based on what everyone said, pre-majority unionism, when it's done right, when it is militant, rank and file led, and something Dave is saying is that's sort of intrinsic to pre-majority unionism, right? You can't really have it unless it is militant, worker led, highly democratic, right? Maybe not. I think that's a question to pose. But in some ways, it sounds a whole lot like militant, rank and file led, Nlrb recognized unionism, right? So let me ask these two questions, one that we got from the audience and one that Becca posed to us, and they're sort of similar. So the first question is, when is a time not to use pre-majority unionism? Is there a time? Are there indicators to sort of tell us when we should be using it or not, or when we should take that on as a strategy? And then Becca's question, how much emphasis should we put on eventually collective bargaining, right? So in a lot of our pre-majority union formations, we think we're doing this in the interim to build power, to build militancy, so that one day we can have an election, right? The question is, I think what Becca was sort of asking is should that be our horizon at all? So I'll put those both to you all. And I'll let whoever wants to chime in first. Becca, yeah.
Just to clarify, I guess one of the factors that we should have in the mix for this conversation is that it's a lot of work. And another one of the questions is, how do you get people super active? It's a lot of work to always be marching on the boss. And so one of the things that a contract gives you is a breather to begin to do some other types of projects outside of the language of the contract. So that's something to just put in the back of our minds. What's one reason not to? That might be one. And I do think that the political movement that is required to, I don't know, change the Georgia Constitution is the kind of movement that I want to be building, right? Like I want a movement that could do something that big and that important. And so it's not a question for me of if, but of how, of the relative emphasis of that as a goal versus the base building, the real core of the activity, and really listening to what the members' most immediate desires are. Maybe that's the state constitution, maybe it's not. Yeah, but I'm interested in other folks' thoughts.
Ani.
I think I would say that there's always a time for pre-majority unionism, but there are ways to do it incorrectly. The secret is that I don't really think of AWU as a union. I think of it as a structure that's hosting like 1,000 different union campaigns, because there's so many different job types, job categories, groupings, offices, all this sort of stuff, right? And there are circumstances where you're not ready to organize a given workplace, right? People are not at that level yet. You need to have more conversations. The beauty of our model is that we can ease into that, right? We're not ready to introduce the U word, but we can talk about having an equity committee. We can talk about doing petitions, direct action, stuff like that, right? Of course, that's unionism anyway, but I think the other way to do it incorrectly is like, what is your goal of forming a union, right? If you are forming a union and it's just you and your 10 friends and all the radical people get sucked into one area and refuse to talk to anybody else, I mean, you're not actually doing anything beneficial for the long-term movement, right? So I think there's a way to do it wrong, but probably not that many. As long as you're here for the process of, learning from your mistakes and working towards an objective.
Awesome. Dave or Jim, do you want to weigh in on these questions of when not to use pre-majority unionism, or how much emphasis to put on eventually getting to collective bargaining?
I don't know when you would not. I mean, you call pre-majority unionism, but basically, as Dave eloquently expressed it, you're building a union. So that's how you build a union. And you always put forward that we always have the goal of collective bargaining. And there were several, at least twice in our history. I know, like in 2007, after we won that big lawsuit with and our membership was up, and our ability to petition, it got to almost to a majority on petitions. We asked for recognition. We approached the company for recognition then, and there was another time, I think in 2014, we did it again. So at certain times in our efforts, we have, they have supporters there. We ask for recognition and push for that. That would always be our strategy, as we build up, but in the life of the union, we have ups and downs, just cycles, but we continue to build, and I don't think it's ever, I wouldn't think there's not a time. You always need to build a union from the rank and file. So that'd be my answer. You don't want to do it any other way, really.
Yeah, love it. Dave.
Yeah, I would just add that, I don't know any situation when you wouldn't want to build a union, whatever you call it, right? It used to be people say, oh no, what about when there's a hot shop? That was a fantasy that a lot of union organizers had, that they were going to find some workplace that would organize instantly, right? And so they'd say you don't want a pre-majority union. I don't think that's the situation anywhere in the United States today. The other thing I think of is bargaining goes on all the time, right? Workers are always bargaining with the boss. They want a day off. They're going to come in to work late. They want to change this. Groups of workers want to change their work schedule. So I think, part of our task we got to learn is, how do you keep pushing that? And people are doing it. It sounds, on the campus, those examples. But, we can't pretend that bargaining doesn't go on in non-union places. It does all the time. Part of the trick will be to make the boss recognize that they're dealing with the union. And that may take a little bit. The other thing is, you got to take into account the specific laws that people are dealing with, right? So in some places, we want to build a majority support or majority membership of the union. It doesn't mean we'll ever get recognition, all right, legal recognition or a legal contract, because of the laws that are against that until we change those laws. So there's no hard and fast here. I think the key is building big, militant, fighting unions.
Awesome. All right. So we just have a few minutes left. I'm going to pose a new question to you all that came out of something that Ani and Becca said. And then I'll mention some questions that are in the chat so folks can connect afterward, because there's specific questions about specific campaigns. So in pre-majority unions and non-sort of contract unions, you have the ability to have wall-to-wall unions, right? Where you are wall-to-wall, meaning across sectors within a given employer, right? So you don't have that burden of the NLRB distinctions. You can actually organize across sectors. Now, something that Ani mentioned, and then it's also something that, so Ani was talking about, okay, we got like 17 different groups, something like that, right? 17 different campaigns. And then Becca was talking about this monthly call where you set the priorities with the entire membership. So the question is, in these wall-to-wall structures where you are trying to organize across sectors and across blue and white collar workers and all sorts of different job categories, how do you set priorities? Because this is something we're struggling with as well, right, in my own union. How do you set priorities? This is something that sort of the IBM workers were talking about 30 years ago, right, when they had their pre-majority union back then, right? How do we figure out what our priorities are when we know we need some sort of priorities to win, right? We can't do 1,000 things at once, right? So how do we set those priorities when we have so many different job categories we're organizing? And unfortunately, we have about 1 minute each to go around. So can you distill that down into a minute? Whoever wants to go first. Or maybe Becca, we can, oh no, Dave, yeah, go for it.
I was just going to say, it really answers what Becca said earlier. You have membership meetings, you have discussions with the members, and you work it out. And that may take some time. But even in places where we have union contracts, we used to have a shop that had 8 different shifts, rotating shifts. In order for them to hold democratic meetings, it would take 3 weeks, right? But you figure out, how do you involve as many members and other people as you can? To me, that's the only answer. It may be slow. It may be not the sexiest thing there, but you got to have those discussions and let people make the decision.
Awesome. Yeah, Ani, go for it.
I mean, I would say it's really hard and we're still learning, and I'm really glad to be on panels like this because some of y'all need to come and talk to our members because we're really new at this. But I feel like for me, it's really important to take a scientific approach to organizing. So what is our strategy? What are we going to try as a given action? That's an experiment. Like, did that work or did that fail? Is this a good thing to use in another condition? Stuff like that, right? So I think the simple priority is that we need to help the workers who are worst off at the company immediately, because those are the workers who are going to be most ready for organization and class consciousness. But I think that when the stars align for a campaign, when something is winnable and when it's something that you can whether it's something that you can be ready to rally a bunch of workers around and fight for, right? And it starts with, I think, a lot of what Dave is saying, how we've talked about that is you need to do one-on-ones. You need to have conversations in the workplace. How are you going to solve problems if you don't know what the problems are, whether they're a union member or a non-union member? We have to go and investigate what the issues are so we can solve them, right?
Yeah, Becca.
So I think that one of the challenges is we are a member-led union, which means that initiatives don't happen unless members are willing to really head it up and make it happen. But we are also wall to wall, which means that there are profoundly different circumstances for different members. There is the person who makes $140K and is a tenure track professor. And then there is the person who makes $14 an hour and works at the facilities plant. And all of these people are in the same union. Who is it who can sit at the meeting longer to lead the initiative? There's differences in access to leading those initiatives. And so I think the counterbalance to that is this thing that you mentioned about culture. So a culture of care. When you build up a culture in your union that makes sure that there is a little bit of step up, step back as a complete norm in all of your spaces, you can begin to kind of counteract some of those differentials. And we are a work in progress. We're still figuring out how to do it. But I think we're getting better and better. We're moving into some organizing at the public HBCUs, which have been disproportionately impacted by that underfunding I talked about earlier. We're really learning as we go, and check back in 6 months and I can give you a little more info about maybe how to do it or how not.
Awesome. All right, we have to close out now, but Jim, do you have any last words on this question of how do you set priorities when you have many more job categories than you normally would under the Nlrb distinctions and an Nlrb?
We have in our plant, we have Cummins workers, and we have some contract workers like CW contract maintenance, housekeeping, and facility maintenance, and they're part of our union members as well. And we fight on their issue for issues. In fact, right now our president of CAMU is a CNW worker, leaning on his CNW workers, but Cummins workers too in the fight, and so he's been very effective in doing that. So all I can say is we have membership meetings, and we have we reach out, and we've taken on not just Cummins workers but contract workers, because we all, as they say, help build this engine, make the engine. But so we fight for equity for everybody, not just the Cummins workers, but also the contract workers in the plant.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for these reflections. As Megan said in the chat, there's so many good questions here. We're going to send them to the panelists. Any panelists want to reply, we'll get them back out to everybody and hopefully connect some folks. A few brief words on EWOC before we close out. We have a fundraiser coming up in June, early June. So the link will be in the chat right now. Please join us. I think you can pay, as there's tickets to join us. It's going to be fantastic with comedy sketches and incredible people. Please come join us in early June. And then last but not least, if you are a worker trying to organize in your workplace, you want to be set up with an organizer, please fill out our form. We get back to you quickly and we get going to talk about how you can organize your workplace. So please do that. If you are thinking about organizing, just fill it out. Thank you again all so much. I'll give my round of applause. I wish we could do more vocal round of applause, but thank you all, and we'll be back in touch soon.